first viewing. Cromwell, 1970. Richard Harris plays Oliver Cromwell. Described as having a hangdog expression with cracked, rasping voice and rather sullen. A sullen prig who hates power. Alec Guinness plays King Charles I. A strained performance. And Kim Hughes directed this. Also stars Robert Moore, Dorothy Tewton, Timothy Dalton, Michael Jaston, Patrick Weinmark, Frank Finlay, and Patrick McGree and Charles Gray. So a distinguished British cast, really. So there we have it, Rise to Power. So it's 1640 and the film opens in Cambridge, where Cromwell is perusing the land that he owns, and he gets two visitors, and they're coming to ask him, one assumes, to become involved in a revolution. Cromwell is a squire, but he's planning to leave with his family for the States, and he describes an England in the past which he felt was worth staying for, but now the prospects are bleak, and the men who arrived at his home want to try and persuade him to stay on. We get a gist of the political situation, with Cromwell laying out that the king is responsible for widespread corruption, stealing from the poor to layer him and his friends with unquestionable wealth, and Cromwell's aware that dissenters are dealt with harshly. The discussion moves on to the idea of not having to defend England against the Scottish army, but more a civil war to dethrone the king. Cromwell hears this suggestion stroke plan, and he's abhorrent to the treasonous thoughts. We then move on to further conflict with the king's men and the earl of the area confiscating land that's deemed common law by Cromwell, and there's a confrontation. Further issues in the church, where religious Catholic symbols prompt Cromwell to go on the rampage, his anger overpowering as he destroys the artifacts. Him being Church of England Protestant, hating the concept of Catholicism. We get another sort of political history lesson. The war in Ireland, Earl of Stratford returns, reports on the losses there. The Scots are in the northeast. There's a discussion about the army, or the lack of one, about raising troops and the potential for a backlash, more people wishing the king's reign over. So we move to the parliamentarians willing to loan the king some dosh so he can recruit an army on condition that the law becomes a constitutional monarchy rather than an absolute monarchy, thereby the king effectively relinquishing power over Parliament. Firstly, the Earl of Stratton proposes to the king to arrest 4 of the members of Parliament who stipulated conditions on the loan, but once we're in Parliament, that's turned around and a death warrant is issued for the Earl of Stratford by Parliament, and the King's forced to sign the warrant, which leads to the Earl having his head chopped off. Great scene where they're sitting round a table with Guinness at the top, King Charles, discussing the notion of an absolute monarchy versus a constitutional monarchy, and the pros and cons of democracy. And to say the least, King Charles is not impressed with this notion, describe it in quite negative terms about it originating with the Greeks, and there's some wonderful rhetoric in this scene between Guinness and Harris about the notion of loyalty, patriotism, and of course amidst all this is the battle between the religious factions, one of Catholicism and the other of Protestant, and it's clear that Cromwell believes that the rise of Catholicism is a poison that needs to be eradicated as soon as possible. Clearly, Charles is comfortable in nurturing Catholicism for his own benefit. Standoff between the king and the 5 rebels. First, the king arrest warrants on high treason for the 5. 4 flee and the 1 remains, Cromwell of course, and then he gets the unilateral support of the House to condemn the king's action as a treason against the people. The consequence, King Charles dissolves Parliament. The film then moves into the stage of civil war. We see Cromwell and his supporters rallying round, and with their weaponry, with their horse and chivalry and their supporters. Both sides frequently refer to God being on their side, which typifies the degenerate thinking of the time. This notion of this Almighty there to save them. But we're now into the war phase, from the generals on the hill, so to speak, looking down on the lesser lings getting destroyed, murdered, killed. This is British history. So dignified, set to at a specific time agreed by the senior members of the armed forces as they assemble at either end of this field. It's all spiffingly British. Timothy Dalton on the King's side behaving like it's a sport with his jocular enthusiasm to draw blood with his sabre. It's all rather gory. The King's forces retreat, but we capture this image of Cromwell on horseback as he looks round at the carnage, the fire, the death all around him, and you sense that he's thinking, why is this happening? The current circumstances are reflected by Cromwell's argument with Manchester, led by Robert Morley. He sees the task beyond them because they aren't trained. They have a lot of heart but not a lot of guile, and he's determined to go and train an army and come back and win. We skip forward to training of those men with Cromwell at hand to show exactly what he's requiring. And then he returns to this new army. The film really falls down here because, you know, clearly there's a time gap here, but it's sort of not really, the plot isn't logically clear. It's concertinaed in for the sake of, you know, the movie. You know, we're talking about, well, one guess months between battles here, but it's all condensed into the same frame, really. The King is overjoyed at the news that Cromwell's army is within 6 miles, but it's only 3,000 strong, whereas Manchester's army, who was supposed to be a joint force, he, the King, has 7,000, so he's cock-a-hoop at a resounding victory. So it's to Naseby in June 1645. The combat goes on and on. Okay, good sets, I guess. Certainly costumes fine, but it's just so dreary. So to nightfall, assessing the loss, and we have this scene where Cromwell sees the arrival of one son, only to note that the second has been slain and is slumped over his horse. It's poignant. Some internal politics amidst the fighting members of the government leads to Cromwell being appointed as Commander-in-Chief due to shortcomings from the others, Essex and Manchester. We get a snapshot of the higher echelons within the King's army, all the chiefs. He is prepared to invite, bring in Catholics from Ireland, Europeans from France to enable his forces to win the day over Cromwell, who's basically winning. As Guinness peruses over the board with the the flags of his forces over the map of England. It's intriguing to see the acting prowess just through body language, through facial mannerisms of this high-class actor without speech, but also as a monarch. With Charles's wife and heir, son, frisked away to France soon after, the film captures the moment when Cromwell arrives and places Charles under arrest. He's forthwith taken to London. So with the war won, then leads on to the usual sort of problems where corruption starts to seep through, with Manchester trying to negotiate a separate deal with the king. This is intercepted by Cromwell, and the matter is still not fully resolved. Cromwell's leader of the armed forces then goes to the king with proposals for a constitutional parliamentary system of government. But although the king acquiesces as soon as he's out of sight, he basically makes it clear that he's not even considering looking at the documentation. Becoming aware of the king's intransigence, Cromwell accepts the reality that the king has to go, and so a charge of treason is brought against him. The court retire to consider their verdict of treason. There's lots of debate. There's a number of members who still have some sort of loyalty to the King Charles I. Cromwell speaks forthrightly about the treasonous acts, lays it all out, and then suggests that if one of the members wants to try to get the king to agree to a constitutional monarchy where the power is held by the House of Commons, but he ignores that. So Cromwell then hands down the warrant that needs to be signed by all as a decision to execute the king, and of course the first man refuses to do so. As the court clerk reads out, delivers the sentence, Charles demands that he have some say, which is refused. But what I found fascinating is looking at the non-verbal language of Cromwell as the sentence is read out, and his eyes moving between the person who reads it out and others around the court and the king. Brilliant acting by Harris. Sir Thomas, the one who failed to put his signature to the document, then comes begging for the king's life with £40,000. Cromwell stands firm on his principles, which can't be bought. We then reach the day of the execution, and there's some time dwelled on the king, members of the family, staff, showing their sort of grief at the while Guinness, in his portrayal, is trying to deliver a sort of sense of strength. We revel in the beheading at Westminster amongst a crowd of thousands. Following the beheading, Cromwell announces to those throngs in the building that that's the end of the monarchy, the beginning of a republic. After a brief moment back at his home in Cambridge with his wife, shortly after, members of Parliament come to his house wanting to elect him as the king, per se, a figurehead, and it's greeted with laughter by Cromwell. Cromwell quickly changes with vigour, defiant vigour, to the suggestion that he should become a figurehead type king, and challenges them all that they've lost sight of the fact that they beheaded the king to enable power to be shared in Parliament. We then move on as Cromwell rejoins his position in the parliamentary chamber, and what he's hearing, of course, is makes him want to cringe and curl as members show their deep-seated desire to remain where they are without being subject to further re-election, and corruption is creeping in quickly. Cromwell delivers a scathing attack on the assembly, and the presentation by Harris is awesome. His rage ends in him dissolving the Parliament once again. Following this, Cromwell took the lead. He became the Lord Protector and serving for 5 years. So just to go summarise some of Cromwell, which I didn't catch, Robert Morley stars as Earl of Manchester, initially an ally in the Houses of Parliament with Cromwell, but then becomes sort of corrupt. Good performance by Dorothy Tooting as the Queen, albeit a bit of a small part. Frank Fringley, John Carter, he's one of Cromwell's brothers in arms, so to speak, and he ends up, as a result of his alleged treasonous words about the king, he ends up being hung on the orders of Cromwell in a scene that's quite disturbing. Prince Rupert, he is one of Charles's nephews, played by Timothy Dalton. He loses the battle in Bristol and is banished by Guinness. Patrick Widmar, Earl of Strafford, he's an early casualty for his behaviour. Charles Grey, Lord of Essex, can't remember too much about him.